The bells of the capital had rung without pause for 3 days and 3 nights, and then, in a single heartbeat, they stopped. 40,000 people stood pressed together along the royal mile of Caldenmere, and not one of them made a sound. A baby that had been wailing went still against its mother's shoulder. An old soldier lowered the cane he leaned on and stood straighter than his knees wanted. For one long, trembling breath, an entire kingdom seemed to forget how to speak. Because the young prince and his wife had just stepped through the palace gates, and they looked like the future no one had dared to hope for. To understand that silence, you have to go back to the morning, when the sky over Caldenmere was the gray of cold ash. The old king, Aldous, had been gone for 11 days. He had ruled for 40 years, and the people had loved him the way you love a mountain, without thinking about it, simply trusting it would always be there. Now the mountain was gone, and the whole land felt unsteady. In a quiet room high in the palace, Prince Tristan stood at a tall window and watched the crowds gather far below. He was 36, the only son, and he had spent his entire life waiting for a day he never truly wanted to come. His hands were cold. His collar felt too tight. The robe they had dressed him in weighed on his shoulders like wet stone, and the crown waiting on its velvet cushion seemed less like an honor and more like a question he could not answer. Are you enough? He had heard the whispers all week, that he was too gentle, that his father had been a lion and he was only a quiet man who loved books and his children and long walks no one knew about, that the kingdom needed iron and he was made of something softer. A door opened behind him. He did not turn, but he knew her step. Aveline crossed the room without a word. She was dressed in deep blue, the color the people had chosen themselves as a sign of mourning turned to hope. She stopped beside him, slipped her hand into his cold one and held it. "They're all out there," Tristan said finally. His voice was low. "Waiting for him, and they're going to get me." Aveline looked out at the sea of faces. Then she looked at her husband, at the boy she had met at university, the man she had married in a smaller chapel than this one, the father who fell asleep reading to their children. "They're not waiting for a lion," she said softly. "They're waiting for someone who will stay." The great doors swung open, and the cold morning air rushed in to meet them. Tristan and Aveline stepped out together, and the procession began its slow walk down the royal mile toward the ancient cathedral of St. Maron. The streets had been swept and scattered with white petals, and the cobblestones shone wet beneath them. On either side, behind low wooden barriers, the people of Caldenmere waited. They had come from everywhere: fishermen from the southern coast with sun-cracked hands, farmers who had traveled 2 days by cart, schoolchildren in neat rows, grandmothers wrapped in shawls who remembered the old king's own crowning half a lifetime ago. Tristan had been told to walk straight ahead and look forward. He found he could not. His eyes kept drifting to the faces. He saw an elderly man in a faded military coat, the medals on his chest polished to a shine that must have taken hours. As Tristan passed, the man lifted one shaking hand to his brow in a stiff, proud salute. He had served under King Aldous in a war 40 years past, and now he was offering that same loyalty to the son. Tristan slowed, just for a moment, and gave the smallest nod. The old soldier's eyes filled, and he held the salute until the prince had gone by. A little further on, a girl no older than 6 broke free from her mother's grip and darted to the barrier. In her fist she clutched a bunch of wildflowers, half crushed and clearly picked that morning from some roadside. A guard moved to stop her, but Tristan raised a hand. He crossed to her, knelt down on the wet stone in his heavy robe, and looked her in the eye. "Are these for me?" he asked. The girl nodded, suddenly too shy to speak, and pushed the flowers at him. Tristan took them as carefully as if they were made of glass. "Then I'll carry them the whole way," he said, "and you'll be part of today forever." The girl beamed. Her mother pressed a hand to her mouth, and all around them the people who had watched began to murmur, not the cold whispers of doubt Tristan had feared, but something warmer, something that moved through the crowd like a current. Aveline watched her husband rise, the small flowers tucked into his hand beside the formal gloves he had been given, and she said nothing. She didn't have to. They walked on. The cathedral grew larger ahead of them, its spires sharp against the brightening sky. Tristan no longer felt the weight of the robe. He felt the eyes of his people, and for the first time that morning he did not feel afraid of them. He felt that he belonged to them, and they to him. The great bronze doors of St. Maron waited at the top of the steps, slowly beginning to open. Inside the cathedral, the air was cool and still and smelled of old stone and beeswax candles. Thousands had gathered within, nobles, dignitaries, the loyal and the curious, filling the long nave in their finest clothes. They had been talking in low, restless voices, the way crowds do when they are waiting and uncertain. Then the doors at the far end opened, and the morning light poured in behind two figures, and the talking died. Tristan and Aveline stepped across the threshold side by side. Light fell through the tall colored windows and scattered across the floor in pools of red and gold and blue. The couple walked into it slowly, the prince still carrying a small bunch of wildflowers in his hand, his wife steady and luminous beside him. That was the moment the silence happened, the silence the whole kingdom would talk about for years. It was not the silence of boredom or of grief. It was the silence of 1,000 people realizing all at once that they were looking at something true. There was no arrogance in the way the young couple walked, no cold royal distance. There was only a man who looked terrified and determined in equal measure, and a woman who walked as if to say, "Wherever he goes, I go." An old bishop near the altar would later tell his friends that in 50 years of ceremonies, he had never heard a room go so quiet. It was as if, he said, everyone forgot to breathe at the same time. Tristan and Aveline reached the steps of the altar. There, on its ancient cushion, sat the crown of Caldenmere, the same one his father had worn and his father before him. Tristan looked at it, and for a heartbeat the old fear flickered back. Then he felt Aveline's fingers brush his, once lightly. He knelt. The bishop's voice filled the cathedral, reading the words spoken over kings for centuries, and as the heavy crown was lifted and lowered onto Tristan's head, something shifted in his face. The fear left it. What remained was calm. He rose, a king now, and turned to face the gathered crowd. And before he spoke a single word of the speech they had written for him, he did something no one expected. He turned to Aveline, took her hand, and drew her up the final step to stand level with him, not behind, not below, but beside. A small gesture, a whole world inside it. A ripple moved through the crowd, soft as a held breath finally released. Somewhere near the back, the old soldier from the street, who had pushed his way in to watch, wept openly and did not wipe his eyes. The new king of Caldenmere looked out at his people, and his people looked back at him. And in that shining, silent hall, the whole kingdom seemed to lean forward to hear what he would say. King Tristan did not read the speech they had written for him. He folded it once and set it aside on the altar rail, and a nervous stir went through the watching nobles. When he spoke, his voice was quiet at first, so that the room had to strain toward him. "I am not my father," he said. The words landed like a stone in still water. It was the very thing the doubters had whispered all week, and now the king himself had said it aloud, in the holiest hall in the land. "I am not the lion you loved," he went on, and his voice grew steadier with every word. "I cannot be, but I have watched my father give 40 years to this country, and I learned one thing from him that I will never forget. He did not rule because he was the strongest man in the room. He ruled because he never once stopped loving the people in it." He lifted the small, half-crushed bunch of wildflowers a child had pressed into his hand that morning, and held them up so the light caught them. "A girl gave me these on the road today. She had nothing to give a king, so she gave me weeds from the side of a path, and they are the most valuable thing I will hold all my life, because they remind me who I serve. Not the crown, not the throne. You, the fishermen, the farmers, the children, the old soldiers who still stand when their king walks by. Out in the city, the speech was carried on loudspeakers down the Royal Mile, and the 40,000 who could not fit inside heard every word. And it was there, in the open air, that the silence finally broke. It did not break into noise all at once. It began with one voice, the old soldier's daughter perhaps, or a fisherman who had traveled 3 days. Then another joined, and another, and then the whole avenue, and then the whole city, until the sound rose up like a tide and crashed against the cathedral walls. People who had come to mourn a king found themselves cheering for one. Strangers gripped each other's arms. The grandmothers wept. The children waved. Inside, Aveline stood beside her husband with her eyes bright, and Tristan reached for her hand once more, and this time he did not let go. He had walked into that cathedral, a man unsure he was enough. He walked out a king his people had chosen with their hearts, not just their tradition. In the years that followed, when people spoke of that day, they rarely mentioned the gold or the robes or the ceremony. They spoke of the silence, the way an entire kingdom had gone quiet the moment the young couple appeared, as if the land itself had paused to recognize something rare. And they spoke of the flowers, a king who carried a child's weeds to his own crowning, and held them up before lords and bishops as the truest treasure he owned. Caldenmere had been afraid it was losing everything. Instead, on a cold gray morning that turned to gold, it discovered it had found exactly what it needed. Not a lion. Someone who would stay.